The hall was nearly silent, the faint echo of footsteps in the distance the only reminder that life continued outside these walls. I glanced at the clock. It was well past 9, but I wasn't quite ready to leave. I lingered, letting the quiet of the empty lecture hall wash over me. It was a space that felt timeless, like it held within it all the thoughts, questions, and quiet dreams of everyone who had passed through. I was startled out of my thoughts by the sound of the door creaking open. Professor Callahan stood in the doorway, his familiar silhouette framed by the soft light from the hallway. He looked surprised to see me still there, his eyebrows lifting slightly as he took a step inside. "Still here?" he asked, a gentle smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Most students would have left hours ago." I returned the smile, feeling a warmth at his unexpected presence. "I guess I just enjoy the quiet," I replied, gesturing around the empty room. "It feels different after everyone's gone." He nodded, his gaze moving over the rows of empty seats. "It's almost like the room itself remembers," he said softly, his voice tinged with a kind of reverence. "Every conversation, every moment of understanding, it all lingers in a place like this." I watched him, struck by the wistfulness in his tone. There was a weight to his words that I hadn't expected, a depth that hinted at something personal. He moved closer, settling into one of the front row seats with a sigh that seemed to release a lifetime of memories. "It's been years since I first started teaching here," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Back then, I thought I had all the answers. But the older I get, the more I realize how much there is still to learn." His words hung in the air, filling the space between us with a quiet intimacy. I felt drawn to him, not just as a professor, but as someone who had spent a lifetime seeking answers, grappling with questions I was only just beginning to ask myself. "Is it worth it?" I asked softly, surprising even myself with the question. "All the sacrifices, all the time spent searching for something?" He looked at me then, really looked, and I felt as though he were seeing something deeper, something I hadn't even recognized in myself. "That's a question I still ask myself," he admitted, a hint of sadness in his smile. "But maybe it's the asking that matters. Maybe that's where we find meaning, in the search, not the answers." His words resonated within me, touching on something I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The silence that followed was heavy but comforting, like a shared understanding that needed no further explanation. We sat there, enveloped in a silence that felt meaningful rather than empty. The gentle hum of the air conditioning and the soft glow from the few overhead lights only added to the sense of seclusion. I felt the quiet gravity of his words settle over me, a weight that was both comforting and challenging. Professor Callahan had always seemed so certain, so unshakable in his convictions. Seeing this side of him, a man who still held questions close to his heart, felt like discovering a hidden layer of someone I thought I knew. After a moment, he looked over at me, his eyes warm and understanding. "What about you?" he asked. "What keeps you here, in the quiet of an empty hall?" I hesitated, the usual impulse to answer quickly giving way to a desire to be honest. "I guess it's the feeling of being on the edge of something," I admitted, glancing around the room. "Like there's so much I want to understand, but the more I learn, the more elusive it all becomes. Sometimes I wonder if I'm chasing something that's impossible to reach." A small smile played on his lips, one that softened the lines on his face. "Ah," he said softly, "the paradox of learning. It's a lifelong pursuit, one that offers as many questions as it does answers. But perhaps that's what makes it beautiful." I nodded, feeling a kinship in his words, a resonance that made me want to share more. I don't know if I'll ever feel like I've found my place," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. "There are days when I wonder if I'm on the right path, or if I'm just lost." He regarded me thoughtfully, a quiet compassion in his gaze. "I think everyone feels that way at times," he said, his tone gentle. "Even those who seem the most confident often carry doubts beneath the surface. It's part of what makes us human." His words eased something within me, a knot of self-doubt that had been tied tight for longer than I cared to admit. For a moment, I felt as though he saw me, not just as his student, but as a person with dreams and fears, someone trying to navigate the uncertain terrain of life. There was a comfort in that, a sense of being understood that was rare and precious. "Thank you," I murmured, feeling a warmth bloom in my chest. "I don't think I realized how much I needed to hear that." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands thoughtfully. "You have a spark, you know," he said, his gaze steady. "A curiosity that goes beyond the ordinary. Don't underestimate the value of that. It's a gift, one that not everyone possesses." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks at his words, unsure of how to respond. His praise was genuine, spoken with a quiet conviction that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced before. The air between us grew thick with a quiet intensity, an unspoken understanding that went beyond words. "Sometimes it feels like more of a burden than a gift," I admitted softly. "Like I'm carrying something that's too big to hold on my own." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps that's why we find people along the way who can help us bear it," he said gently. "We aren't meant to carry everything alone." There was a depth in his voice, a sadness that hinted at his own struggles, his own burdens that had perhaps gone unshared. I wanted to reach out, to say something that would lighten the weight I sensed in him, but the words felt too fragile, too personal to be spoken aloud. Instead, I let my gaze meet his, holding it longer than I might have dared under different circumstances. In that moment, I saw a softness in his eyes, a vulnerability that made him seem almost ageless, as if he were both a young man grappling with life's mysteries and a wise mentor who had seen it all. The two sides of him existed in harmony, creating a depth that drew me in, making me feel a connection I couldn't quite explain. He must have felt it too, for he didn't look away. The silence between us grew charged, filled with unspoken words and lingering questions. I felt my heart beat faster, an awareness settling over me that this moment was different, that we had crossed an invisible line into something more profound, more intimate than the usual boundaries of professor and student. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand resting on the table between us. It was a small gesture, almost tentative, but it held a weight that was impossible to ignore. He glanced down at my hand, his expression softening, and for a heartbeat, I wondered if he would reach back. But instead, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. "There's a lot more to this world than we often realize," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "And sometimes we find pieces of it in the most unexpected places." The words held a kind of reverence, a hint of something unspoken that lingered in the air between us. I nodded, feeling the truth of his words resonate within me, as if he had put voice to something I'd always known but never fully understood. We sat there in the quiet, the distance between us both vast and achingly close. I felt a shiver run through me, a sense that this moment was one I would carry with me for a long time, a memory that would remain etched in my heart. And as I looked into his eyes, I saw a reflection of my own feelings, a recognition that whatever had passed between us was as real for him as it was for me. The room seemed to close in around us, the world beyond fading until there was only the two of us, bound by an understanding that words couldn't capture. I could feel the pulse in my fingertips, my hand still resting on the table, achingly close to his. The quiet tension between us felt both fragile and powerful, like a spark waiting for permission to ignite. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on my hand, then shifted his eyes back to me. There was a softness there, a gentleness that both invited and restrained. It was as if he wanted to reach out, to cross the invisible line that held us apart, but something in him held back, caught in the weight of what such a gesture would mean. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" he murmured, almost as if he were speaking to himself. His voice was low, filled with a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "We think we have it all figured out, and then someone comes along and reminds us that we're not as certain as we once believed." His words sent a shiver through me, and I nodded, feeling the truth in his quiet confession. "Maybe certainty isn't what we're meant to have," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's enough to just feel." For a long moment, he looked at me, a quiet awe in his expression. The depth of our connection, the rawness of it, made the air feel thick, almost electric. And though either of us moved, I could feel the gravity between us, drawing us closer in a way that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "I never expected to feel this way," he said softly, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Especially not now, at this point in my life. But here I am, standing on the edge of something I can't quite explain." I swallowed, my heart racing as his words settled over me. I knew he was opening a door, letting me see a side of him that he rarely, if ever, shared with others. It was a vulnerable, unguarded moment, one that made me feel both honored and humbled. Without thinking, I reached out, my fingers lightly brushing his. The contact was brief, tentative, yet it sent a wave of warmth through me, a quiet thrill that made my pulse quicken. I expected him to pull away, to break the connection that had formed between us, but instead, he stayed, his hand resting gently beneath mine, a silent acknowledgement of everything that lay between us. "Sometimes," he murmured, his voice a whisper that barely filled the space between us, "we find ourselves drawn to people who help us see the world differently. People who challenge us to look beyond what we thought we knew." I held my breath, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a quiet revelation. His hand, warm and steady beneath mine, was a silent reassurance, a promise that whatever this was, it was real. And in that moment I knew that we had crossed an invisible line, one that would leave us both changed, no matter where we went from here. He leaned forward, his eyes searching mine, and I felt a quiet intensity in his gaze, a depth of feeling that took my breath away. There was a question there, unspoken yet unmistakable, a silent invitation that asked me to trust, to let go of the doubts and fears that had always held me back. Slowly, I nodded, my hand tightening slightly over his, a silent affirmation of the connection we shared. His gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a glimpse of the person he was beneath the composed exterior. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "For letting me see you, for letting me be seen." A soft smile touched my lips, and I felt a warmth blossom in my chest, a quiet joy that made me feel both grounded and free. "Thank you," I replied, my voice barely more than a breath. "For being here, for this moment." We sat there, our hands still joined, the silence between us filled with a peace I hadn't known was possible. The world outside the lecture hall seemed distant, irrelevant, as if nothing else mattered but the two of us, caught in a moment of pure, unfiltered connection. And as the minutes slipped by, I knew that this was a memory I would carry with me always, a moment that had left a mark on my heart, a quiet reminder that sometimes, the most unexpected connections are the ones that change us the most. The silence between us held a kind of reverence, like the quiet after a shared secret, a trust formed in the delicate balance of vulnerability and acceptance. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips, my hand resting atop his, either of us moving as if afraid that even the smallest shift might shatter the intensity of what we had created in this quiet space. He looked down at our hands, his expression softening, a trace of wonder flickering across his face. "You know," he began, his voice filled with something like awe, "I think I'd forgotten what it felt like to truly connect with someone. To feel understood." The words caught in my throat, and I felt a warmth spread through me at his confession. "I think we spend so much time protecting ourselves," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, "that we forget what it means to let someone in. To share those parts of ourselves we keep hidden." I could feel the weight of my own words settling between us, the truth in them resonating in the quiet of the empty hall. His eyes held mine, steady and unwavering, and in that gaze I felt an invitation, a willingness to be seen, to be known in a way that went beyond titles or roles. It was rare to find such openness, especially in someone like him, whose life had likely been filled with expectations and responsibilities that left little room for moments like this. As if sensing my thoughts, he offered me a soft, almost wistful smile. "Years go by so quickly," he said, his voice laced with a bittersweet nostalgia. "You get so caught up in the tasks, the daily routines, that one day you look around and realize how much of life you've let pass you by." I swallowed, feeling the depth of his words settle within me. There was a longing there, an unspoken desire to reclaim the pieces of himself he felt he'd lost along the way. But maybe it's never too late, I replied softly, my hand tightening slightly over his. Maybe there's always time to find those pieces again, if we're willing to look. His gaze softened, and he gave a small nod, as if my words had given him a sense of peace, a quiet reassurance that perhaps the journey wasn't over, that there was still more to discover. You have a way of seeing things, he murmured, almost as if he were speaking to himself. A perspective that's rare and beautiful. I felt a blush rise to my cheeks at his words, an unexpected warmth that made me feel both vulnerable and cherished. There was an intimacy in his gaze, a quiet reverence that made my pulse quicken, and I felt the weight of an unspoken question linger between us. Do you ever feel like you're searching for something? He asked, his tone almost tentative, as though he were afraid to admit the depth of his own yearning. Something you can't quite name, but you know it's missing? I nodded, feeling the truth of his question resonate within me. All the time, I admitted, my voice soft. It's like there's this ache, a longing for something I can't quite put into words. But being here, in this moment, it feels like I'm a little closer to finding it. He smiled, a gentle, understanding smile that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't known I needed. It's a rare thing, he said quietly, to find someone who feels like a kindred spirit, someone who reminds you of parts of yourself you'd forgotten. His words hung in the air, a testament to the connection we had forged, and I felt a quiet thrill at the realization that he felt it too. In that moment, I felt the distance between us dissolve, replaced by a warmth that wrapped around me, a sense of belonging that was both thrilling and terrifying. His hand shifted beneath mine, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture so natural, so gentle, that it felt like a silent promise. Our eyes met, and in the depth of his gaze, I saw a reflection of my own feelings, a quiet recognition that this was something rare, something precious that neither of us had expected but both of us were willing to cherish. He leaned closer, his face just inches from mine, and I could feel the warmth of his breath, the quiet intensity of his presence. Thank you, he whispered, his voice filled with a reverence that made my heart swell. For this moment, for being here. My voice trembled as I replied, I think we're both exactly where we're meant to be. It was a simple statement, but the truth of it filled me with a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that this connection between us was real, was meaningful. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken emotions, and I felt myself drawn to him, a magnetism that went beyond reason or logic. Slowly, he leaned in, his hands still clasped around mine, and for a breathless moment, our faces were so close that I could see the flecks of color in his eyes, the faint lines of experience and wisdom that made him who he was. And then, with a gentleness that took my breath away, he pressed his forehead to mine, a gesture so tender, so full of quiet affection, that it left me feeling both vulnerable and cherished. We stayed like that, wrapped in the warmth of our shared connection, either of us needing to say a word. In that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, this bond we had discovered would remain, a quiet truth that would carry us forward, reminding us of the rare beauty of finding a true connection in the most unexpected of places.